Don't forget to turn off your mic, and the same for Henry. Okay, so we are on air now, I'm told, so we can start the session, I guess. So welcome to everybody that's in the session, and to begin with, to my dear panelists who are so kind to make their time available and share their knowledge and experience in this field. So this panel will deal with the question of developing country status, which we entitled to be or not to be a developing country. That's the question. We were hoping to do this last year, like many of the sessions, but then for reasons that we're all familiar with now, that was postponed. So we think it's still a very topical issue. And I think we are lucky to have a very interesting panel together with eminent people. And I'll briefly introduce them, and then they can introduce themselves further if they like to add. We have Mina Mashayekhi, who is a senior trade and investment advisor to the private and public sector. And she's also linked to some university, and she has formerly had a lead role at UNCTAD. So she will tell us a little bit about the special differential treatment and the history and a little bit of the current situation. Then we have Trudi Hartzenberg, who's very well known to many of us and who is the executive director of TRALAC in South Africa and Stellenbosch. So welcome, Trudi, glad to see you again. Trudi was also, or is, I should say, an advisory board member of the WTO Chairs program, which I've been leading myself for quite a number of years. And we have worked very closely together. The same applies to Henry, who is an advisory board member of the WTO Chairs program, and who is an associate professor of law at Singapore Management University, and who has also written quite a bit about developing country issues, particularly in relation to China. And then we have Leonardo Lahud, the Deputy Secretary of Foreign Trade from the Ministry of Economy in Brazil, who has been kind enough to step in at fairly short notice for Luca Ferraz, who is the Secretary of Foreign Trade and who is now actually in a very important meeting dealing with Mercosur issues. He was taken away at the very last minute. So I thank you very much, Leonardo, to have been so kind to jump in at the very last minute. So let me say a few words. By the way, I was asked to mention that this will be recorded, so that I think the idea is to put it on YouTube later, that people can review and listen to the presentation. So I will be very brief, say a few words on the topic, and then I'll leave it to the panelists to introduce the various elements. So the development aspect and developing country issue is not a new issue per se. It has come up more recently. In fact, in the meantime, it's already 2 years ago that the US kicked off a discussion on this issue with some concrete proposals. But in itself, it's not so new. It has been an issue for a long time. And no surprise that the Doha Development Agenda that was launched 20 years ago was considered to be a development round. So the issue of development has always had a prominent place in the debates. The question is, like, how to give it some tangible meaning, so how to make it operational. So it's getting particular attention today because there have been some rapid evolutions in approaches to the development issue and in the development of a number of developing countries that have grown quite rapidly and have become important players in the international trade arena. So perhaps to put things a little bit into the context, I believe it's important to go back to the origins of the GATT in a way, and to the beginning of the WTO and the Marrakesh Agreement. When you look at the preambular part of the Marrakesh Agreement, you'll find that the role of trade is an important element in raising standards of living, creating full employment. Well, many of you know the key objectives. But here it comes. It says explicitly that recognizing that there is a need for positive efforts designed to ensure that developing countries, and especially the LDCs among them, secure a share in the growth of international trade commensurate with their economic development. So this is the starting point, basically, that has been guiding the policymakers in their discussions. Now, what the agreement doesn't do is provide operational language on how to do that. So the discussions on that have evolved actually considerably. So the approaches have evolved since the days of the GATT and the WTO, and many more new approaches are being developed. And we'll definitely hear some of the ideas from our panelists, because some of the countries that have grown particularly fast have adjusted their, let's say, their philosophy, their approaches, their economic development programs in light of their economic growth. So there has been a lot of thinking and evolution in the thinking, as well as the policy, the economics, and the role of trade per se. So it's interesting that actually, except for the notion of LDCs, we don't know actually who are the developing countries, and that is the key question now. So S&D has been around for a long time, and Mina will tell us a little bit more about that, how the features perhaps also have evolved, how S&D has tried to keep up with the pace, and how it is being looked at today. But that doesn't take away that the key question remains, like, who are developing countries? And as I said, for the LDCs, we know because they fall in the category of the United Nations that have been defined. But the question then is, the key principle that has been applied in the GATT days was the issue of self-election. So the self-election question has been put in doubt by the Americans, who are saying we don't no longer accept that. But so how are you going to replace that? What is going to be the guiding principle for developing countries? And to remind you that many of the issues in the DDA, in the negotiations, were complicated by particularly this question, how to differentiate between different categories of developing countries and how to make the rules applicable to countries that developed faster than others. So this, and then not to mention the question of exceeding countries that acceded to the WTO, were they entitled to developing country status, and in what way? So there are lots of questions out there. Some of the developing countries are, as we will hear in the discussion, member of the G20, member of the OECD, or they are applying for membership, and the Americans have clearly said we cannot accept that those countries to be treated as developing countries. So there's a big discussion out there, and what we can do in the 75 minutes that we have here, just give a few ideas on this particular question, see how it is being addressed. And I would like to start by Mina. So in order to conduct a sort of a discussion, have a dialogue, conversation between ourselves, I would like to ask Mina, you have had a long working experience at a very senior level at UNCTAD, and you have dealt particularly with developing countries, and the S&D issue has been an evolving issue during your career at the UNCTAD. So I would like to know a little bit from you, can you put the S&D debate into its context, historical and present context, so we understand better what are the challenges and the issues for developing countries integrating into the multilateral trading system, but because after all, that is the goal. So Mina, if you allow me, I would like to start with you, and please give us some insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be part of this panel. S&D has always been, of course, very much in my heart. I've worked throughout my career on S&D issues and development and sustainable development. Now, we find ourselves at the current time in a much changed world. So even, we have read a lot of literature, recent literature on S&D, and we know since the pandemic and also since, a lot of populist movements and nationalist movements have appeared in many countries, that there is a huge backlash to hyperglobalization and liberalization, and trade being actually the focus in terms of development, because development is a multidimensional, has a multidimensional construct. And you cannot just think that through trade we are going to achieve development, and through trade rules one can achieve development. So one is this realization that liberalization does not lead directly to growth and development, without any preconditions being in place, and structural reforms, and access to technology and innovation, and also infrastructure, and now the digital economy. When we look at what happened, with the pandemic and COVID, we see that now everybody talks about a new normal, a reset, and I think this context of our discussion on S&D should also be looked at in the context of a new normal and reset. That is, there is more poverty, there is more realization that even the most developed countries did not have the structure, the institutions, the development that would have been required by such huge challenges as COVID, climate, and even the complexity of digital economy. Of course, different countries are facing it differently, including with the fourth industrial revolution. So countries have realized that, we talk about, US being very strong, but now we see even the US is putting in place industrial policies that were actually before ideologically thought to be, the worst thing. We were not allowed to talk about industrial policies or policy space. Whereas now we see many developed countries are extremely interested in focusing on industrial policies and production of, again, manufactured goods with the industrialization. So the whole context of S&D cannot be just looked at as, is it self-declaration, is self-declaration good or not, and its effectiveness, but we should look at it in the totality of the new situation and context we are in. Now, when we look also at the present time, we see that some developed countries and some developing countries, including China, could put huge packages of support in place to to deal with the COVID situation and the financial results of that situation. Whereas developing countries, most of them have access to the bare needs for vaccination and healthcare. They also could not put such packages in place. So in such a world, we cannot think about now we will do away with, although not effective, an S&D, the concept of S&D, the right to an S&D, which is embodied in WTO agreements. Then we also see that the WTO has lost its credibility and legitimacy. And even, looking at different organizations analyzing this, we see that the senior economists from many of the major multilateral organizations are talking about that this narrow view of development through just trade does not work anymore, that employment is becoming more important and labor than capital, discussion of just dealing with capital, and many countries, including the US, are giving attention to employment. So I'm just setting the scene for coming back to our, what our panel is about, that there is a number of broken promises in the Doha round. Doha round front-loaded S&D and implementation issues, achieving rebalancing, achieving some, getting away from the imbalances and difficulties of implementation. But this actually did not get realized. And this is the result of broken promises, and that led to this lack of trust in the trading system, lack of trust. So now we have to see how we can correct that, and putting front-loading S&D in terms of actually eliminating it, I think will deal with more lack of trust and more problems with credibility of the trading system. Also, when we discussed, you mentioned the TFA and other new models of S&D. And we see that, of course, they haven't yet given very clear results. It's a very good step. The TFA could be the new model for the future. Also, services agreement could be the new model for the S&D, where you don't actually talk so much about S&D, but progressive liberalization, that developing countries, it's in their own hands to liberalize, to open their market as fast as they see fit, that would fit their development situation, commensurate to their development situation. So that also is a very good model that we can follow. In terms of effectiveness, there are many studies that have been done, and recently Leuven Institute had come up with the fact that maybe 20% of the provisions of an S&D are actually maybe more binding or could be more effective. And so, I mean, the issue is that it seems that although, now about 30 countries have been identified through the US proposal that could be, let's say, graduated through these 4 criteria, including membership of OECD, G20, 0.5% for trade, it seems that actually the focus is really on one big country, which is China. And we see that, also developing countries have put a separate proposal forward about their views of what they think about development and S&D, which is a separate one than the one that they put forward with China. So one can see that even developing countries, even though they don't express it directly, they also face some huge challenge from China that has been extremely successful and a miracle of development, actually. And China successfully also used GSP to develop some of their sectors. So when I hear a lot and I read a lot that, well, actually nobody has had real concrete, measures that have been effective, but China actually very brilliantly used some of the S&Ds, the GSP regime and other, measures to develop its economy, which could be defined as S&D, although in the accession they gave up many of those areas in the WTO agreements that are defined as S&D. So we see China is the second contributor in terms of budget of WTO, the hugest exporter and importer. So this is a challenge. Then China has been identified as a strategic competitor with the EU, and the same with the USA. So the proposal of USA with the 4 criteria is based on that. But I think I would argue that the position of Norway and the countries that are supporting Norway seem to be a more well thought out proposal, where they don't actually go after doing away with S&D. They would like to improve its effectiveness. Already, they recognize that in the context of TFA, which is a good model, some countries have given up the use of S&D, including Brazil, and even willingness has been shown by other countries separately from the TFA to actually willingly give up S&D. And I think that's a better route to go to gain, progressively that those countries would self-graduate themselves. And I think, I'm not sure if I've used all my time. Yes. So these were the first few points I wanted to put forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if you can switch off your mic, you have a chance to complete the information further with whatever you want to add to this. I thank you very much. Very thought-provoking. You put it into. Put your mic off. Very thought-provoking, very clear statements, putting it in a broader context, not finger-pointing anyone. There's a lot out there. There's also a responsibility at the level of the developed countries. You made clear that some of the promises that have been made in the past have not been delivered on. And the world has changed, as you rightly explained, with the COVID, of course, and also the industrial policies that are being pursued by others. And interesting point that you make at the very end, that China has used the GSDP very successfully and allowed it to actually develop very fast. That is a nice lead in to the next speaker, Henry, who has given a lot of thought on the China issue. And I would like to ask him perhaps a few questions, if he could react to the question of developing country treatment, whether China received that when they joined the WTO, and perhaps you can say a few words on that. But I have some more questions that I would like you to address. Depending on what you have to say on that, do you think that China will receive developing country treatment in any further and new negotiations that are on the table? There are so many areas out there, like the fisheries, perhaps the e-commerce discussions, maybe on the investment facilitation. But then I have a very simple question for you. That's my final question. That is, could you tell us how we solved the China issue? Sorry for being a little bit provocative here, but maybe you could give us some ideas what you think about how the developing country status in the WTO could be addressed with regard to China. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maarten. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm especially pleased to speak after Mina, because Mina has made my task much easier about touching upon several of the issues that you raised in your question, Maarten. So I will try to be brief on those issues. So I was a bit amused when over the past 2 years or so, all this discussion about China's development country status resurface at the WTO, because these remind me, of what happened 20 years ago when China joined the WTO. It was like yesterday once more all over again, because in China's WTO accession, actually, China did actively seek to be designated as a development country. It was actually one of the 3 key principles as announced by President Jiang Zemin when China applied to join the WTO, when WTO formed in 1995. But there was a lot of resistance even at that time, because many WTO members cited significant size, rapid growth, and transitional nature of the Chinese economy, and trying to deny China development country status. And these are 3 reasons, as we can see, resurface again in the current discussions. So in the end, what happened? In the end, the WTO actually never made a formal decision on whether China should be a development country. Instead, they adopted what they call a so-called pragmatic approach by saying that whether China get a development country treatment on specific issues would be subject to a case-by-case analysis. And the end result is that China actually didn't get most of the special treatment that would be accorded to a development country. For example, if you look at China's tariff reduction schedules, its tariff reduction greatly exceeded those of development countries, because development countries in the Uruguay negotiation were not expected to make a lot of reductions, but China had to reduce a lot of its tariffs. And actually, on some of the commitments, China even far exceeded those of even developed countries. For example, China agreed in its accession that it eliminated all export subsidies on agricultural products. And if you guys recall, this is something that the WTO members were only able to, the major WTO members like US and EU were only able to accept 14 years after China acceded to the WTO. And China also undertook to eliminate all export taxes, which until these days is still allowed under WTO rules for all other WTO members, and actually is still widely used by many governments. And then you also have the so-called WTO plus obligations and WTO minus rights, including the designation of China as non-market economy, which basically downgraded China to a status that is even below that of a normal WTO member, not to mention a developing country member. So I would say that China, in substance, actually didn't receive much of the S&D treatment for developing countries when they became a WTO member, other than the ability to use the title developing country. So what happened after accession? If you look at after accession, China basically put itself into the development country camp and try to basically campaign together with other major development countries like India and Brazil. For example, in 2003, it joined India and Brazil to form the WTO G20, you know, to call for agriculture reform by the developed countries while retaining the flexibility for development countries. But if you look at the in terms of the actual benefit China's getting after its accession, as I mentioned earlier, didn't get most of the SDN treatment. This is partly because China didn't get them in the accession negotiation, and another reason, and this is a big reason, is because many of the SD treatment under the current WTO agreements actually are either not available for developing countries with large trade shares like China, or they have already expired by the time you know, China acceded to the WTO. So at the same time, if you look at the new negotiations that China has participated in, you know, even though the WTO has not been very productive since its formation, but it did reach some agreements like the trade facilitation agreement. But if you look at the trade facilitation agreement, China actually didn't really claim for development country treatment. It voluntarily actually gave up the right to use Category C measures, and it has actually removed all the Category B measures as of now. So it basically implemented all the obligations under the TFA well ahead of many other developing countries. But of course, at the same time, I do realize, as you hinted earlier, Maarten, that it would be difficult both at the technical level and also at the political level on some of the issues to grant China developing country treatment. And one good example, as you mentioned, is fisheries subsidies, and that is because China is one of the largest providers of fisheries subsidies in the world. So unless China is willing to make a major commitment to reduce these subsidies, the chances of the negotiations succeeding would be very slim. So what would happen in the future? So that is the $6 million question. Well, I think we have to look at you know, at two sides. On the one hand, you have to look at what China think about the issue. China has tabled its WTO reform proposal, and in the proposal, China has stated very clearly that S&D treatment is an entitlement that China, here I quote, will never agree to be deprived of, end quote. So China has made a political declaration that it would never agree to be deprived of S&D treatment. But I personally do not think that this means that China would be reacting to many of the negotiations like some other WTO members such as India and Africa, and refuse to go along, because there's also another part of China's WTO reform proposal where China said it is willing to take up commitments commensurate with this level of development and economic capacity. And indeed, this is consistent with what China has been doing in the WTO, because as I mentioned earlier, you know, if you look at TFA negotiation, China was one of the first developing countries to join the TFA negotiation, and it is also one of the first developing countries to comply to implement all the TFA obligations. So that means that China might be willing to take a more nuanced approach, you know, on different issues. And if we look at the structure of the current negotiations in the WTO, I mean, you can also say that China could be making more concessions or giving up more than what people commonly believe, because nowadays effectively most of the negotiations, if not all, in the WTO are conducted at the pro-lateral level. You look at all these JSIs, joint statement initiatives on e-commerce, on investment facilitation, on services, domestic regulation, and so on. So on all these issues, China is actively participating. So because JSI by definition, they are pro-lateral, it means that you do not have to participate. And when you participate, you do not come with the expectation that you would get automatic S&D. So I think basically the fact that the WTO negotiations are now conducted using the pro-lateral model kind of solve the question for us. So we don't have to worry about the issue if most of the negotiations are going to be conducted using the pro-lateral approach. And I think China would be very happy to pour its weight on issues of interest to itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. I will not try to summarize all the points, but you made a couple of very strong and forceful points, which is that what you were saying is that basically China makes a claim on the S&D provisions and is very strict and formal on that, although in practice it hasn't taken much advantage of that. But it wants to formally remain committed to what you described and what you referred to from the China authorities as an S&D, as an entitlement, which is a political declaration. Perhaps we can come back to some of these issues, because I was asking myself the question, why would China, let me ask it differently, would China not gain more from showing flexibility in this regard and giving up on that position, given its lead position in world trade, rather than sticking to a political decision where it could maybe lose more? But let me come back to that question later. Let me also invite the panelists to look at the questions that are being raised in the public chat, so that once we have completed our roundtable, that those of you who feel comfortable with addressing some of the questions, there are two main questions on the table now. If you would like to respond to those. In the meantime, let me turn to Leonardo. I have a couple of questions to you, particularly relating to the issue of self-declaration. Maybe you can say a few words on that. And what could you see as an alternative to self-declaration, given the fact that there's so much diversity amongst the developing countries? And when I look at the chat questions, they are referring to the fact that there is actually no differentiation among developing countries in the WTO, in the rule book of the WTO. Anyway, we can look at that at the same time. So, in fact, one of the questions that I would have liked to ask you, like, are the constituent elements of the S&D provisions as set forth in the WTO agreements appropriate? Are they the right ones to tackle the challenges that countries face in their development perspectives? In their development perspectives, sorry. In their development perspectives, and particularly in relation to the dynamics of the global economy and in world trade. And my final question to you would be, Brazil, as a developing country, you have had an entitlement to S&D. Have you used it? Has it had any? Has it had any meaning, economic meaning in it? And I refer to what Mina was saying earlier, where she said that actually the literature shows evidence and provides evidence that in many cases, or at least in some cases, I think she mentioned 20% of the cases, the S&D provisions have not been exploited. So, sorry, there are quite a few questions out there, but maybe you can enlighten us a little bit more about Brazil's position, about the issue of self-declaration, and how we can look at the issue of differentiation between developing countries.
Thank you, Maarten, and thank you, Mina, Trudi, Henry. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Conversation. And Maarten, many questions, difficult questions. I don't know if I have all the answers, but historically, and the differences regarding the role that the issue of development should play in the WTO negotiations explain to a large extent, in my view, the difficulties in revising and updating the normative framework of the organization. On one side of the debate, as we know, are generally speaking developed countries and more likely to emphasize the positive impacts of trade liberalization on development. On the other side, we have the developing countries, which, without denying the advantage brought by a greater degree of trade openness, have prioritized preserving space for public policy, the policy space, aimed at development, attributing less importance to discussions on commitments in new areas. To uphold this position, this second group of countries has used the argument that, based on the principle of S&D, developing countries should have more flexibility to devise trade policies to pursue development. But indeed, and this is important to recognize, disparities among these developing countries became more prominent after the 1980s. According to the OECD, for example, the number of high-income countries and countries converging to high-income status rose from 46 to 105 between the 1990s and the 2000s. The second group of developing countries is still integrating vigorously into international markets. And here we have China, we have Brazil, we have South Korea, while the last group has remained stagnant and poor. Despite these substantial structural changes in the developing world, the only countries which graduated to the developed status at the WTO are the ones that have become members of the European Union. And this means that countries like South Korea, like China, like Brazil, they are horizontally and all considered developing countries and benefit in the same way from S&D provision WTO agreements. In this sense, and I highlight here that there is a need to bridge the gap between developed and developing countries. And in my view, we need a pragmatic, and this is what Brazil has been defending, we need a pragmatic approach to bridge the current divide in the WTO. But what exactly do we need to change? As I see it, the basic issue here in the WTO's current approach to S&D is that it revolves around exempting developing countries from WTO obligations instead of helping them to comply with the WTO obligations and thus integrate these countries fully into the multilateral trading system. We know the importance of the multilateral trading system. And the trade facilitation agreement, as Mina said, Professor Enhi as well, and Trudi is going to speak a little bit about the trade facilitation agreement, but the trade facilitation agreement offers a good starting point to the challenges that we have here and to change this reality. The TFA is, in fact, a departure from past agreements in that signatories, the parts of the agreement, have specifically identified short and long-term implementation timelines, and as well as noting those provisions for which they will require technical assistance in order to implement that provisions, that commitments. And this approach is novel in that it links the S&D to an identified need as opposed to general opt-out on certain commitments. In terms to conclude this initial contribution, I would like to quote Annabel Gonzalez, our the new deputy DG at the WTO. She has written that, and here I'm quoting her, there is a strong rationale to have all larger economies abide by multilaterally agreed and applied disciplines because their policies affect international markets. And here I also want to touch upon one point that Mina has brought. Trade is certainly an essential economic and foreign policy tool. That can, but it does not necessarily bring. It can spur growth, job creation, and poverty reduction. We need, of course, the preconditions, the conditions that are also related to development. So I would say that, point out that trade and development development, they are directly linked. And the multilateral trading system, these negotiations and future negotiations on the S&D, they are important to restore the WTO, not only these negotiations, but also, of course, that we have many things to discuss internally in the WTO, but they are important to restore the multilateral trading system, the WTO as the center of the world trade. This is quite important. And you asked me also, Maarten, about Brazil, and yes, Brazil has benefited from S&D provisions. But at the same time, we have a new reality. We are facing a new reality, and that's what we have been calling the members to discuss. But we need a pragmatic, as I said, we need a pragmatic approach. We do not have simply to establish some criteria, and that in order to classify some countries as developing or not developing. It depends on the negotiation. It depends on the products. It depends on the market. So this is not quite simple. And here I conclude my initial contribution, Maarten.
Thank you, Leonardo, for a very pragmatic and realistic approach, at least it seems to me, which is basically what you're saying. We need to bridge the gap. We need to find a pragmatic solution to take care of the real issues. And what you're saying is that let's move away from the traditional approach, which has been one of the characteristics of S&D, which is exempting countries from their commitments and obligations, to helping them to bring them on board in the system. And I recognize a bit what you're saying, because for many years I've been providing technical assistance in the WTO, trying to help developing countries integrate into multilateral trading system, and that's one of the core functions, although you won't find it in any of the declarations, but it's one of the pillars of the WTO, even if it is not written in the book as such, to provide TA, and that's what many organizations, including UNCTAD, has done. So what you're saying is that the TFA, and Trudi will talk about that a bit more, is a good starting point. And what I liked also what you referred to is a reference to identified needs. That is, that clearly put on the table where the issues are and where you need assistance, so we can build on that. And also, as part of your pragmatic approach, you refer to the possibility of looking at different markets, different issues, perhaps different sectors. Also, this is, in some of the proposals that have been put on the table by the developed countries, that reflects some of the ideas that you have aired just now. And I know that Brazil is joining the OECD, and therefore you have given up on many of your S&D provisions. And it's also good to hear that Brazil has benefited from S&D, and like you're saying, we are now in a new reality. So I think based on what we have heard so far, we can look at more closely at the trade facilitation agreement, where Trudi Hartzenberg has perhaps some ideas to present to us. Trudi, just by way of asking you, do you think that the TFA could serve as a model for the new way S&D should be provided? And if that is the case, how actually does the TFA address the challenges in terms of timeframes for achieving convergence and the lack of financial and technical capacity to implement commitments? So, a related question would be like, how can the possibility of doing nothing, just stand still, basically, and this approach be addressed? So basically, how do you see the TFA, because the previous speakers have referred to the TFA as a model that could help actually look in a positive manner by providing technical assistance, etc. And interesting enough, Henry Gao indicated that China, as a developing country, has made no claim to any of the Category C options that are out there. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this issue.
Thank you so much, Maarten, and thank you very much to my colleagues who've already introduced a number of the strands of the discussion around the Trade Facilitation Agreement. I think all of this points to the complexity of integrating unequal partners in a rules-based governance system for trade, but also the imperative of doing so, and the importance of collective buy-in to the approach, the design, the model, and in particular, the practical modalities of supporting that integration. I think when one takes a look at some of the important ambitions that we find expression for in the TFA, it is perhaps a beginning of a rethink and a new approach to ensuring that no one gets left behind. And how do we do that? Now, my colleagues have already referred to a number of the issues which are, of course, particularly important. Traditionally, we often find that there's reference to timeframes or opting out of particular commitments and provisions. But very importantly, what the Trade Facilitation Agreement does is to focus on some of those fundamentals which are essential to implement any kind of governance commitments when it comes to international trade, but also, in a sense, bringing that nexus of trade and development together. Trade, I think I certainly would agree, holds a lot of potential to deliver development outcomes, but there are prerequisites. And to be honest, while member states may be under certain pressure in the negotiations and commit to certain obligations that they may subsequently find that they cannot implement effectively, this puts the collective enterprise of rules-based governance at risk. And therefore, I think this has to be a discussion where both the potential recipients of special and differential treatment, developing and least developed countries, but also those who may well be in a position to assist, to provide technical financial assistance in order to address the technical, policy, legal, and institutional deficits which developing and least developed countries may be facing. So this is, in a sense, the thinking that underpins some of the design and architecture of the Trade Facilitation Agreement. It does not address the issue of identity and self-selection, though, and I think that's quite important. So this remains a tricky issue to negotiate. But what the Trade Facilitation Agreement does is to recognize that not only time is important, but this collection of assistance and support. And it's not only financial support, but it's also technical assistance, institutional assistance, and building in checks and balances in terms of an institutional ecosystem, which is very, very important to ensure that those milestones in the implementation pathway can be achieved. So as my colleagues have indicated, we have different categories of commitments in the TFA. Those that are going to be implemented immediately on entry into force, category A, and then we've got category B and C. And category B, we have a transition phase. And that is particularly important to keep in mind, that there may already be progress in terms of the domestic machinery and implementation plans to address and to achieve some of those commitments when it comes to trade facilitation. But very importantly is category C. And this is where, again, the individual member state would identify a time frame and the necessary requirements in order to implement those commitments. And I think this is very often a situation where technical assistance may also be required in terms of the identification and the articulation of that implementation plan. So I think we've got to think very, very carefully what is necessary in order to make this work, so that over time, we see convergence to a collection of rights and obligations and an appropriate balance of those rights and obligations among member states. But what do we see? And I think this is quite important to keep in mind. Do we see some member states doing nothing? Do we see good progress? What is the evidence? And I think if we take a look at the ratification track record, we're standing at something like 154 member states now. That's pretty good. But it is the detail of those commitments and the implementation track record is the real test of not only the commitment, but also the capacity to give effect to commitments that have been undertaken. In the African context, this agenda is particularly important because it resonates very much with our own trade and integration agenda. So if we take a look at the African Continental Free Trade Area, in the Protocol on Trade in Goods, we have 4 annexes that deal with trade facilitation issues, customs and border management, transit, and others as well. A very important connection as well in terms of this collection that we call the trade facilitation agenda is, of course, certainly our experience from Africa indicates that this is where we stand to address the non-tariff barriers. And certainly in the context of Africa, there's ample evidence to indicate that these are far more pernicious barriers, not only in terms of promoting intra-Africa trade and our trade with global trade partners, but also in terms of improving our competitiveness. And I think this takes on a particularly important dimension now. As Mina mentioned, we find ourselves potentially in a new normal. So when we think about this compact, the collection of trade facilitation issues and how we support developing and least developed countries to achieve what is necessary in order to be part of this global trade facilitation compact, it's so important to keep in mind that the trade facilitation agenda is, of course, integral also to the industrial development diversification, broader productive capacity development and diversification agenda. So this is where we start seeing the connectors to a much broader trade and development agenda. And I think that makes it all the more important. What do we see among African countries, for example? And I think a small country to the north of where I'm sitting today, Namibia, for example, has done evidently a great deal of work, both in terms of analyzing the policy, technical, institutional deficits, and articulated a very clear to-do list with clear targets, timeframes, the necessary support, capacity, financial, technical assistance that is needed, and appropriate sequencing. And I really want to emphasize the issue of sequencing. This is so important to keep in mind in terms of building that policy, legal, institutional infrastructure to be able to facilitate trade and also, importantly, facilitate cross-border linkages, investment, value chain development, and integration into the broader global economy as well. But many African countries, unfortunately, have not taken up the opportunity and perhaps had the opportunity to do the necessary groundwork to come up with a similar plan to request what is available in terms of technical assistance and capacity building. And I think this is where we need to be focusing, because this becomes another potential governance gap where some developing and least developed countries could be left behind. So I think really thinking through a very pragmatic agenda, as Leonardo has advised us to do, is so important. On the institutional infrastructure, just keep in mind, of course, that there's an early warning mechanism so that if a member state starts to see challenges emerging in implementing what it has agreed in terms of its time frame with the necessary assistance, then it can call in for additional assistance. But again, are we getting all the calls for help and assistance when they arrive? So I think those are extremely important to keep in mind. There's also an expert group, and there is the possibility of shifting, for example, between group B and category B and C. But again, what we do need to recognize that although these facilities are available, if we have significant deficits in the domestic governance infrastructure, we need to think very carefully how we support the member states in order to really articulate the particular challenges that they encounter timeously, and so get assistance to be able to catch up. Trade facilitation, just in conclusion, Maarten, it's perhaps a less contentious agenda than many, many others when it comes to rules-based governance matters. So improving customs and border management, reducing dwell times at borders and so on, it's difficult to argue against that. So there is the very broad collective public good dimension to trade facilitation, which makes it so, so important. If we improve from an African country's perspective, developing, least developed country, our customs and border management, reduce those myriad of barriers that we face at border posts, we improve not only our capacity to trade amongst ourselves, but with global partners. So there's a multiplier effect, which is in the interest of all in the global trading system. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Trudi, and I'm going to give the floor to the other panelists to be able to react. But before doing so, let me just try to summarize a few takeaway points from your intervention. That is, what I've retained is that basically we need to, like other speakers have said, we need to be pragmatic. We need to work towards more of a partnership between the developed and the developing countries to make sure that the developing countries can get the support and the assistance where they need it to integrate into the trading system. And that's exactly what the TFA provides for. So, but at the same time, countries may need to have some support in identifying where they exactly need their support. And you made two particular points in that regard, that is, or perhaps even three, that is the convergence between rights and obligations, which is, so it is a partnership between those who are asking for support and those who are giving the support. That is the connectors, which you are referring to, and the sequencing in terms of institutional and infrastructure building. And I recognize that as, and I'm not going to develop this point, but we have just recently done a book to which you have contributed yourself on digital trade, where the whole issue of infrastructure is coming out so in such a significant and important way, and Henry has contributed to the book, where that is such a key element in terms of building capacity in the countries and allowing them to integrate into the trading system. I know that Leonardo had a few comments to make on the TFA. If he would like to, he can complement his early intervention, and perhaps then I'll turn to Mina and see if she wants to react to the one or the other intervention. And if en passant you have looked at the two questions in the public chat and want to deal with them, please do so. So Leonardo, you want to react at this stage, and then last I will come back to Henry. So Leonardo, perhaps you want to come in?
Thank you, Maarten. Actually, I would just like to emphasize the importance of the trade facilitation agreement here. As a trade facilitation guy, I led in the past the trade facilitation agenda here in Brazil. And the importance of trade procedures, as Trudi said, we are talking about import, export, and transit procedures here. And countries to have in order to integrate into the global economy, into the world trade, you need to have procedures that are less bureaucratic. And this is the kind of reform that, as I said, and Mina stated, these are preconditions, of course, to trade, and these are preconditions to development. This is an important part of the world trading system. And when we look at investment facilitation, when we look at services domestic regulation, we are also talking about, in a different perspective, of course, we are talking about services and investment, but at the same time, we are looking at the preconditions to integrate fully into the global economy. And that's why I think it is quite important, as in the trade facilitation agreement, when we are discussing investment facilitation, when we are discussing services, domestic regulation, we also have to bear in mind or to pay attention to these specificities of each kind of the provisions of the commitments in order to provide the least developed countries and even developing countries with the necessary tools to fully integrate and to fully be able to absorb the importance and the tools and everything that is involved in these kind of agreements. And here I just look, again, Maarten, just re-emphasize the importance of these agreements, and I see these agreements as the preconditions, of course, that we are negotiating. Then trade facilitation agreement was concluded in 2013, but we're negotiating now the investment facilitation agreement, not a multilateral agreement, I know, but also the services domestic regulation, but they are all related to bureaucracy. They are all related to the precondition. And when we are looking at these preconditions, we need to take into consideration the specificities of the countries of developing or least developed countries in order to have these countries fully integrated into the multilateral trading system. Just to re-emphasize that. And that's why it is so important to have this pragmatic approach.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. Mina, you would like to comment, I'm sure.
Thank you very much. I very much benefited from all the thought-provoking presentations. I have just a few points. One is that, of course, one has to be pragmatic, but in those terms, we should also take into account that, most countries are reducing their technical assistance funds that they were giving before to developing countries. So in such an environment where many countries are turned inwards, and looking at their nationalistic interests, and also facing major difficulties, because we talk about developing, but within each developed country or any country, there are developed aspects and developing aspects. There is poverty, inequality, injustice, and major problems. So I think if also countries start recognizing each other's difficulties, whether that would be more helpful in an S&D context, rather than thinking, this is absolute developed country. And even if you take United States, they have huge unemployment problems. They have huge educational issues that, in recent years, young people are not getting the type of education that they need for today's world, the digital economy and technology. The same way we take the LDCs, the SSA, African countries, they are facing major countries. They have specialized and they're commodity dependent. In the GVCs, they're just producing maybe small parts of the GVC chain, whether it's regionally or in the bigger context, the global value chain. So many countries have adapted to this system of globalization. This will change in future. There will be reshoring. Are we prepared for reshoring? So, which means that the really truly developing countries would need more flexibility and help in putting in place the flanking policies, institutions, structural reforms, digital divide, all these divides that exist would require much deeper technical assistance. It's not just a course you go to and you get training, because now I still see a lot of technical assistance and capacity building, which is really very superficial. It's not the in-depth one, which is required by, let's say, partly by TFA, and then with other complex agreements that these the GSI, the e-commerce agreement, digital economy related agreements. They are not simple agreements you open and then you will benefit. Definitely there are giants there that will benefit, that have giant firms. But developing countries in general, even let's say some better developed, they still don't have any of those even mid-size firms that would be working in the digital economy that could benefit automatically. So we have to keep in mind that the type of technical capacity and capacity building that we need is a different kind. And it would require huge funds. Even in infrastructure, we realize that countries need huge funds. They need to raise they change their fiscal policies. And this kind of deepened support needs to be given attention instead of thinking of definitions, effectiveness. It's time lost in dealing with those things, because that's not the reason negotiations are not going forward. The reason negotiations are not going forward is that these are complex areas and all countries need to get the most benefits possible to integrate into the whole world economy and help their people. So that's another issue. Now, plurilaterals and sectorals. We have been talking about this a long time. I wonder if even plurilaterals and sectors in terms of non-MFN ones would be helpful. Even now, anyway, those, sort of drafts that are being put forward under the statements, they're not part of WTO negotiations. They are, they are parallel to the WTO. This is not part of the multilateral because it has not by consensus been agreed. But what we see is that many developing countries are interested in them. They are very actively participating. So this is another way that we can see that developing countries are, let's say, self-graduating themselves. Now they take very strong interest, whether they are fully for it or not, in the whole dynamics of this, and put joint proposals forward. So that's a plus. That one can see that more participation, more interest, and also recognition that we need to go forward. But plurilaterals and sectorals, if they don't recognize the complexity of the issues and the implications of them, if you take the wrong decision, let's say many of them are related to services. If you take the wrong decision on making commitments in services, it can destroy your health sector. It can destroy your education. Key sectors that are important now we see in this pandemic. So we need to really put in, domestic regulation is much more than just procedural issues. It's the right to regulate, how outsiders would comment on your legislation, how this legislation would ensure these sectors would work well for the whole economy. These are infrastructural services. So what I mean is that, there are so many complex issues that need really in-depth attention, that all these also modeling, you model something, you TFA, you get so much benefit. These are not realistic. That is very attractive. We read these things, everybody comes with their ammunition. If you do this, the world will change. But we have to be now, as everybody is saying, very realistic, very pragmatic in a hugely complex and different world. Thank you.
Thank you for further enriching the debate with some new issues, and I'll come back to that at the end because we have just a few minutes left. I would like to give the floor to Henry. I'm sure you would like to react to some of the observations that have been made. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maarten. I agree with everything that my learned colleagues have said, and I would only add one footnote to Leona's intervention just now regarding the status of Korea. Actually, as of last week, UNCTAD has upgraded Korea from a developing country to a developed country. It has moved, Mina would know this, it has moved Korea from Group A to Group B countries, so Korea is now officially a developed country. I expect that this would also be reflected in the WTO as well, because the two always work hand in hand. Now, the other issue I'd like to address is this question from the audience from my friend Lothar Erin. And he asked a question that I find particularly interesting as a lawyer, because this is a pure legal question. So I don't think audience can see the question. So let me just quickly summarize the question. The question is, whether basically the question is whether the developing country issue can be litigated in the WTO. I think there are basically two layers to the question. First is the abstract question of whether a country is a developing country or not. I don't think this question could be litigated because of the principle of self-designation in the WTO. But then there's a second layer to the question, that is whether a WTO member should enjoy S&D treatment with regard to a specific provision in a specific agreement. I think that one can and has been litigated. And actually, with respect to China, China has tried to litigate this issue in the very first case that it has participated after it joined the WTO, the U.S. Steel Safeguard case. One issue in that case is whether the U.S. could link China's developing country S&D treatment with its GSP under Article 9.1 of the Agreement on Safeguards. And China said, no, you cannot link that. And the US said, well, China is not a developing country, or at least we were not conclusive as to whether China was a developing country in its accession, so I could do whatever I want to do. And the case went before the appellate body, but the appellate body was very shrewd because they basically declined to rule on the issue because they did not really disagree with the panel regarding the other question, which formed the foundation to this question. I always, I think the appellate body made the right decision. But as a lawyer, I think it would be interesting had the appellate body took the opportunity to address this issue. Now, 20 years after China's accession, I think the chances of this question getting litigated in the WTO becomes slimmer and slimmer, especially as I mentioned earlier, because all these new agreements are going to be negotiated on a bilateral basis or according to the TFA approach, as my panelists have mentioned. So I guess probably, we will not see this being litigated in the WTO in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Henry, and thank you for your clarification. I would like to give Trudi an opportunity to answer the last question if she has seen it. It was directed to you. Trudi, do you want to respond to that, please? By the way, the public, this is a public chat, so the people see the question. So everybody has seen the question, I imagine.
Very much, Maarten. The question comes from Rodrigo, and it's, do you believe the multiplier effect has been materialized in the application of other WTO agreements? And Rodrigo mentions the TBT agreement, where of course there are also special and differential treatment provisions, and also reference to technical assistance to be provided to developing and least developed countries. I think what distinguishes the trade facilitation agreement from that is that we have self-identification of priorities in terms of category B and category C, and the specific technical assistance that is required. So I think this is a step in the right direction, where we are really starting to look at the domestic policy, legal, institutional architecture to give effect. In the case of TBT, and we could perhaps add the matter of SBS to this collection of issues as well. Increasingly important to be able to participate effectively in global trade, but also in global value chains. So this capacity to test, to certify, to comply with technical standards, regulations, and so on is absolutely critical. And if we look at SPS issues, certainly from an African perspective, we've seen ample evidence that in terms of our trade with some of our global trade partners, we've fallen down in terms of the deficits when it comes to SPS capacity, laboratories, technical skills, and so on. So this, I think, becomes so important in terms of the foundational fabric for assisting not only to participate in trade, but actually to produce goods and services that meet international standards, regulations. So it's taking compliance to a very important level, but anchoring that capacity and support in the domestic needs of the developing and least developed countries. So I think this enhances, again, productive capacity. And if we're looking at where we find ourselves now and the transformation recovery that is necessary post-COVID, these are absolutely essential. So reducing trade transaction costs, but improving our capacity to be able to produce goods and services that meet the standards, the very important standards for market access. It becomes an asset test of whether we are assisting these developing and least developed countries to effectively participate not only in the global trading system, but in global trade, take up the opportunities that will support their development objectives. Thanks, Maarten.
Thank you very much. And I see that there's a lively discussion starting between Henry and Lothar, and I suggest that perhaps they deal with it bilaterally, given the fact that our time has run out from what I've been told, because we had 75 minutes. I will perhaps just try to make a few concluding remarks from what I take from this discussion, which has been very rich, very enlightening to me, rather than focusing on a narrow possible approach, trying to define a category of developing countries or differentiating them. I think the panel has done a lot of justice in taking a more pragmatic approach and putting it in a broader context with the view of how to assist countries, developing countries, how to assist them integrating into the multilateral trading system in a pragmatic way. And we heard many ideas. TFA was an example that is a good example of how that the partnership between developed and developing countries can be strengthened and deepened. We heard examples of benefiting from global value chains, which requires a whole different set of approaches than just simply a TA that includes explaining the rules of the system and the rights of obligations. But like Mina said, perhaps that's too superficial right now in the current situation, because the world has evolved and the idea is to integrate by developing your economy. So what kind of flanking policies can be developed? How can we achieve inclusiveness of trade, that the rich and the poorer developing countries can benefit from all of that? And we see that the discussions are evolving with a greater and a better and fuller participation of developing countries in, let's say, the new areas of negotiations. They are not necessarily new issues, but they are new areas of negotiations. So the simple fact that they actively engage in those discussions oblige us to think through in a deeper way what is the best we can do as developed countries to help them benefiting from those agreements where they clearly see an economic interest. And whether that's done through sectoral negotiations or plurilateral negotiation, because I think few people believe that there's still much room for a multilateral agreement in any particular area. So how to develop that in a more pragmatic way. So I will perhaps just leave it at that. I think we have done a pretty good job in enriching the debate rather than simply focusing on definitions of developing countries that have been offered by a number of a number of, that's included in a number of proposals, and like the World Bank does and the OECD does. I think the conclusion that we can draw from this panel, that this is not the most useful way forward. The best way forward is looking at how can this partnership be strengthened, and how can we build together in a collective manner to ensure that developing countries integrate effectively in the multilateral trading system and exploit their development opportunities. So let me conclude by thanking all my dear panelists for their excellent contributions, and I'm sure it has triggered further questions, and that's the nicest way to end a panel, I would say. So thank you very much, and take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maarten, for convening us.
Thanks, Maarten. Yeah.
My pleasure to be with you and see you from a distance.